grinding like a fistful of gravel. The bolt slid back. Between the pitted barrel, the stock smelling of mildew and rat piss, and the smirking kid behind the counter, it was clearly a joke to them. Hand the shaking old man the trash. What they failed to realize was exactly what his hands remembered. The bell above the door of Apex Tactical didn't just ring. It chimed a synthetic, cheerful tune that set Tristan's teeth on edge. The air conditioning inside was aggressive, smelling of freshly outgassed plastics, cherry-flavored vapor, and the faint, metallic tang of new brass. Tristan stood just inside the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the harsh fluorescent lighting. He felt out of place, a frayed cotton thread in a room full of Kevlar. His boots, worn smooth at the heels, squeaked slightly against the polished concrete floor. At 72, Tristan's posture had surrendered an inch to gravity, but his shoulders still held the rigid, stubborn squareness of a man who spent his youth carrying things that were too heavy. Behind the glass counter, bathed in the LED glow of a smartphone, was a kid who couldn't have been older than 22. Let's call him Wyatt. Wyatt wore a tight, moisture-wicking polo shirt with the store's logo, his forearms thick and hairless, a tactical watch bulky on his wrist. "Help you with something, Chief?" Wyatt didn't look up from his phone immediately. When he did, his eyes did a quick, dismissive sweep of Tristan's faded flannel, the grease stains on his denim, and the tremor in his left hand. "I need a rifle," Tristan said. His voice was gravelly, dry. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. Used, cheap. Wyatt smirked, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Cheap. Right. Well, we got some entry-level polymer actions on the rack back there. Couple $100 will get you into a cheaper." Tristan interrupted. He didn't have a couple $100. He had $74 folded in his front pocket. He needed a rifle for the county's open amateur shoot on Sunday. First prize was $500. It was exactly the amount he needed to keep the bank from shutting off the power at the small, drafty house he'd lived in since his wife, Martha, died. Wyatt sighed, leaning heavily on the glass counter. He looked at Tristan like one might look at a stray dog loitering near a butcher shop. "Look, man, I don't run a pawn shop. We sell precision gear. You want cheap, you might want to try the surplus store 2 towns over." "You take trade-ins," Tristan said, his pale blue eyes locking onto Wyatt's. "I see the rack in the back corner. The stuff you don't put out front." Wyatt chewed the inside of his cheek. A slow, cruel smile crept onto his face. "You want something from the orphan bin? Suit yourself." The kid walked to the back of the shop, disappearing behind a swinging door. Tristan waited, the silence pressing against his eardrums. His left hand twitched. He shoved it deep into his coat pocket, pressing his knuckles hard against his thigh to still the nerves. He hated that tremor. It made him look weak. It made him look exactly like what they thought he was, a relic. When Wyatt returned, he was carrying something with 2 fingers, holding it away from his body as if it were diseased. He dropped it onto the rubber mat of the counter with a heavy, dead clunk. "There," Wyatt said, crossing his arms. The doorstop. Tristan looked down. It was an old, sporterized bolt action, an absolute bastardization of steel and wood. Sometime in the late 70s, someone had taken a hacksaw to the stock, trying to make it lighter, and succeeded only in making it ugly. The wood was deeply gouged and stained dark with years of soaked-in motor oil and sweat. But the metal was worse. A thick, aggressive layer of orange rust bloomed along the length of the barrel. The receiver was pitted. The bolt handle was entirely crusted over, frozen in the closed position. Tristan reached out, his calloused fingers grazing the wood. It felt damp. He gripped the bolt handle and pushed up. It didn't budge. It was seized solid. Took it in a bulk estate buy, Wyatt offered, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Barrels bent, probably. Crown looks like it was used to hammer nails. Action is locked tight. It's scrap metal, old-timer. But if you want a wall hanger to scare the crows, you can have it for $40. Another clerk, a heavier man with a neatly trimmed beard, walked out from the back. He glanced at the rifle and chuckled. You selling him the Widowmaker, Wyatt? Jesus, don't let him shoot that thing. It'll blow back in his face. They were laughing at him. It wasn't loud, but it was there in the corners of their mouths. In the casual, lazy way they stood, they saw a shaky old man buying garbage because he was too broke to afford anything else. Tristan's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He didn't tell them about the armory in Da Nang, where he'd taken apart and rebuilt hundreds of rifles blind in the sweltering dark. He didn't mention the geometry of Sears or the physics of harmonics. He just pulled out his wad of bills, peeled off 220s, and set them on the counter. I'll take it, Tristan said. Wyatt rolled his eyes, ringing it up. No returns, Chief. Don't come crying when you can't hit a barn from the inside. Tristan picked up the rifle. It was heavy, awkwardly balanced, and smelled faintly of rot. He walked out of the store without another word, the synthetic chime mocking him on the way out. Tristan's garage was a sanctuary of dust and organized chaos. The air smelled of ancient sawdust, penetrating oil, and the sharp tang of ozone from an old space heater glowing orange in the corner. He laid the rifle down on the heavy oak workbench under the glare of a single, bare 60-watt bulb. He stared at it for a long time. It was a hideous thing, a forgotten machine. Tristan poured himself a cup of black, lukewarm coffee from a thermos, popped 2 dry aspirin into his mouth, and swallowed them with the bitter liquid. His knuckles throbbed, a dull ache forecasting rain. All right, he muttered, his voice swallowed by the quiet of the garage. Let's see what they did to you. He started with the bolt. He soaked a rag in Croil, the pungent, creeping oil that smelled like pine and poison, and wrapped it around the receiver. He let it sit for an hour while he meticulously laid out his tools. Punches, a heavy brass hammer, a set of fine jeweler's files, and a small tub of lapping compound. When the hour was up, he clamped the rifle into a padded vise. He took a heavy wooden dowel, placed it against the bolt handle, and struck it with the brass hammer. Smack. Nothing. He hit it again, harder, feeling the shock travel up his wrist. Smack. A tiny flake of rust broke free. He worked the handle up and down, millimeter by agonizing millimeter, until finally, with a grating screech that set his teeth on edge, the bolt slid backward. The inside of the action was a horror show of dried grease, unburnt powder, and carbon scoring. Tristan didn't sigh. He just went to work. He stripped the rifle down to its component atoms. He fought every screw, using a handheld impact driver and a butane torch to break the bonds of rust and time. When the stock finally separated from the barreled action, he threw the rotting wood onto a lower shelf. It was garbage, but he'd have to salvage it later. He couldn't afford a new one. The metal went into a long PVC pipe filled with a harsh chemical solvent. He left it there to soak while he turned his attention to the heart of the rifle, the trigger assembly. This was where the kid in the shop was wrong. Wyatt only saw the rust. Tristan, peering through a jeweler's loupe, saw the raw, heavy steel of an over-engineered sear from a bygone era. It was dirty, yes. The spring was gunked up with decades of cosmoline, but the metal itself was thick and true. Tristan sat on his stool, his back screaming in protest, and picked up a fine-cut file. He didn't just clean the trigger. He mated it. He clamped the sear in a tiny vise and began to polish the engagement surfaces. He didn't use a machine. He used stones, working his way from coarse to terrifyingly fine grit. He worked entirely by feel. The metal had to be mirror smooth, but perfectly angled. 1 degree off, and the rifle would be dangerous. 1 degree the other way, and the trigger would feel like pulling a cinder block through mud. The sound of the stone against steel was rhythmic, hypnotic. Tristan's mind drifted. He thought of Martha, how she used to complain about the smell of Hoppa's no. 9 inches the house, but how she'd always left a fresh rag by his bench. The ache in his chest tightened, a familiar, heavy stone. He pushed the thought away, focusing entirely on the tiny slab of steel in his hands. He wiped it clean, held it to the light. It caught the bulb's glare, flawless and bright. Next was the barrel. He pulled the heavy steel from the solvent tube and wiped it down. Most of the surface rust was gone, leaving deep, dark pits. It was ugly, but surface pitting didn't affect accuracy. The inside of the barrel was what mattered. He ran a bronze brush, soaked in solvent, down the bore 10 times, 20, 50. His shoulder burned, the muscle fibers screaming in protest. He followed it with dry cotton patches. The first 10 came out black as pitch. The next 5 were gray. Finally, 1 emerged white. Tristan held the barrel up to the light, peering down the bore. The rifling was actually intact. Strong, deep grooves. But the crown, the very tip of the barrel, where the bullet exits, was a disaster. Wyatt had been right about that. It looked like someone had dropped it muzzle first onto concrete. A nick in the crown meant the escaping gases would push unevenly against the base of the bullet as it exited, throwing it wildly off course. Tristan didn't have a lathe to cut a new crown, so he went old school. He found a round-headed brass screw in his junk drawer. He chucked the threaded end into his hand drill, dipped the brass head in gritty valve-grinding compound, and pressed it directly into the muzzle of the rifle. He ran the drill at a slow, oscillating speed, rocking it gently in a circular motion. The brass, being softer than the steel, held the grit and slowly ground a perfectly symmetrical, recessed dish into the tip of the barrel, erasing the nicks and burrs. It took 2 hours. His arm shook by the end of it, but when he wiped away the gray paste, the new crown was a perfect, razor-sharp circle of bright steel. By 3 a.m., the cold had seeped deep into Tristan's bones. The physical toll was immense. His hands were stained black, his knuckles swollen, his lower back locked in a tight spasm. He looked at the rotting wooden stock. He took a heavy gouge and aggressively scraped away the swollen, oil-soaked wood inside the barrel channel. He was going to free-float the barrel, ensure the wood never touched the steel, preventing any warp in the stock from affecting the barrel's natural harmonics when fired. Then, he mixed a 2-part epoxy resin, smelling strongly of toxic chemicals. He smeared the thick paste into the recoil lug area of the stock, coated the metal receiver in a thin layer of release agent so it wouldn't stick permanently, and pressed the 2 halves together, bolting them tight. He was betting the action. When the epoxy cured, the rifle's action would sit in a perfectly molded, rock-solid cradle. No shifting, no movement. Tristan wiped his hands on a rag, turned off the space heater, and pulled the chain on the overhead bulb. The garage plunged into darkness, smelling of curing epoxy and solvent. The rifle was ugly. It was scarred, pitted, and worn. But as Tristan limped toward the door leading back into his empty house, he knew the truth. Underneath the scars, the geometry was perfect. Sunday morning smelled of dry earth, bruised wild onion, and sun-baked asphalt. The county range was a wide, flat scar cut into the base of the foothills, trembling under a harsh morning glare. By the time Tristan parked his rusting sedan in the gravel lot, the firing line was already crowded. There were 50 men out there. Most of them were young, wrapped in moisture-wicking camouflage, clustered around heavy wooden benches. They spotted for each other using spotting scopes that cost more than Tristan's car. Their rifles were modern marvels of CNC machining, aluminum chassis, heavy fluted barrels, optics the size of traffic cones, and complex muzzle brakes designed to vent gas and eliminate recoil. Tristan pulled his rifle from the trunk. He had wrapped it in an old, moth-eaten wool blanket because he didn't own a hard case. He slung it over his shoulder, using a cracked leather sling he'd scavenged from a box in his basement. He walked to the registration tent, his boots crunching loud in the gravel. He paid his $50 entry fee with the last of the cash he had to his name, handing the bills to a bored woman with a sunburned nose. She handed him a paper tag with the number 42 on it. "Lane 6, she said, not looking up. "First relay in 10 minutes. Distances are 4, 6, and 800 yards. Steel silhouettes, 5 rounds per distance." Tristan nodded. He walked to lane 6 and unrolled a piece of heavy canvas onto the dirt. He lay down, his knees popping, his lower back immediately seizing up in a tight, warning ache. He breathed through his nose, ignoring the pain, and unwrapped the rifle. The guy in lane 7 looked over. He was a thick-necked man in his 30s, adjusting the parallax on a massive, tactical scope mounted to a pristine $3,000 rig. He stopped, his hand hovering over the turret, staring at Tristan's gun. It was a monstrosity. The wood was deeply scarred, the barrel mottled gray where the rust had been violently scrubbed away. On top, Tristan had mounted an old, fixed 10-power scope he'd found wrapped in a rag in his garage. The scope rings were mismatched, one steel, one aluminum. "You shooting that in the match, buddy?" the man in lane 7 asked. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth. Tristan didn't look at him. "Yes, might want to check your zeros at 100 before you waste your ammo," the man chuckled, turning back to his own rifle. Winds kicking up left to right. "That old thing's gonna pattern like a shotgun at 800. Tristan didn't answer. He opened a plastic Tupperware container. Inside were 15 rounds of ammunition. He hadn't bought them at a store. He had spent Saturday afternoon at his reloading press, carefully measuring out exact grains of powder, seating the long, heavy bullets to the exact thousandth of an inch, ensuring they sat just off the rifling lands of his specific chamber. A horn blasted. The range officer's voice crackled over a cheap PA system. "Shooters, you have 3 minutes for your first 5 rounds at 400 yards. Load and make ready." Tristan pushed a brass cartridge into the chamber. He reached for the bolt handle. There was no grinding, no scraping. The bolt slid forward with the smooth, oily glide of a piston in a wet cylinder, locking into place with a definitive, quiet snick. He settled in behind the scope. The glass was slightly cloudy around the edges, but the crosshairs were sharp. He found the white-painted steel plate at 400 yards. The heat mirage was already rising off the dirt, making the target shimmer and dance like a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. His left arm trembled, the old tremor, reliable as the sunrise. Tristan didn't fight it. Fighting a tremor only makes it worse. Instead, he unhooked the leather sling from the rear stud, looped it tightly around his left bicep, and pulled it taut. The leather dug into his flesh, biting off the circulation, anchoring his arm to the wooden stock. The crosshairs steadied. He rested his finger against the curved steel of the trigger. "Fire," the PA crackled. The firing line erupted, a rolling thunder of sharp, concussive blasts hitting the dirt. The pressure waves thumped against Tristan's chest, The smell of burning smokeless powder and hot brass washed over him. He tuned it all out. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds. He listened to his own heart. Thump. Pause. Thump. He opened his eyes. He pressed the trigger. He didn't pull it. He just increased the pressure of his index finger. Because of his work the night before, the sear engagement was a perfect glass rod. There was zero creep. It simply broke. The rifle roared, bucking into his shoulder. The recoil was heavy, bruised meat against wood, but it was straight back. The epoxy bedding held the action perfectly rigid. Tristan cycled the bolt. He kept his eye in the scope. 2 seconds later, a faint tink drifted back on the wind. The white paint on the steel target sprouted a dark gray smudge, dead in the center of the chest. "Hit," the spotter behind him muttered, sounding surprised. Tristan didn't pause. He loaded the second round, adjusted his breathing, timed the heartbeat. Crack, tink, 5 shots, 5 center hits. The group was the size of a teacup. The range officer called for a ceasefire. The targets were repainted, and they moved to 600 yards. The wind began to pick up, snapping the red flags on the poles. Dust blew across the line, getting into Tristan's eyes, tasting like chalk on his tongue. The guy in lane 7 missed his second shot, cursing loudly as the wind pushed his lightweight bullet off the right edge of the plate. Tristan adjusted. He didn't have external turrets to dial in the windage. He simply held the crosshairs 6 inches to the left, off the plate entirely, aiming at the empty air. He trusted the heavy, hand-loaded bullet to cut the wind. Crack. He waited. Tink. By the time they reached 800 yards, Tristan's shoulder was throbbing with a deep, sickening ache. His neck was stiff, and a headache pulsed behind his right eye. The target at 800 was barely a speck through his old, cloudy scope. The mirage was ferocious now, distorting the shape of the steel. Only 12 men out of 50 had cleared the first 2 stages. The rest were packing up their gear, standing behind the line to watch the final stage. The murmurs had started. They were watching the old man in the faded flannel with the trash pile gun. 3 minutes. 5 rounds, the PA announced. Tristan chambered around. The brass was hot from sitting in the sun. He settled in. The sling dug into his arm, sending pins and needles down to his fingertips. He felt old. He felt tired. He exhaled. Squeezed. Crack. The wait felt like an eternity. 3 full seconds of flight time. Tink. He hit the first 4. On the 5th shot, a sudden gust of wind kicked dirt into his face, just as the sear broke. He flinched. A millimeter of movement. The shot went wide. He missed. Tristan lowered the rifle, popping the bolt open. The smoking brass casing ejected and hit the dirt. He lay there for a moment, letting the blood return to his left arm, feeling the stinging regret of that last pulled shot. He wasn't a machine. He was just a man with tired eyes. He stood up slowly, using the rifle as a crutch. The range officer walked down the line, compiling the scorecards. When he got to Tristan, he looked at the old man, then down at the ugly, hacked-up rifle. 29 out of 30, the RO said, his voice quiet. He shook his head. Ain't nobody else cleared 25 today. Wind's too erratic. Tristan just nodded. He didn't smile. He methodically wrapped the rifle back in the moth-eaten blanket. 20 minutes later, the bored woman in the tent handed him a thick white envelope. There were 5 crisp $100 bills inside. Tristan folded it and shoved it deep into his front pocket. He walked back to his car, the gravel crunching under his boots, the synthetic smell of modern gun oil fading into the scent of hot engine dust. He had the money for the electric bill. But he wasn't done yet. Monday morning in Apex Tactical was quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed, reflecting off the glass cases filled with matte black pistols and expensive optics. The door chimed its cheerful, synthetic tune. Wyatt was behind the counter, leaning on his elbows, staring at his phone. He looked up, his brow furrowing as he recognized the faded flannel jacket and the stooped, square shoulders. Tristan walked to the counter. He unwrapped the wool blanket and laid the rifle on the rubber mat. Clunk. Next to it, he placed his yellow carbon copy of the scorecard from the county match. "I'm returning it," Tristan said. His voice was gravel, completely devoid of emotion. Wyatt blinked. He looked at the gun, then back at Tristan, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "Chief, I told you on Friday. No returns on the orphan bin. You bought it. It's yours." "I warned you it was a piece of junk." Tristan didn't move. "I paid 40. I want the 40 back." "Not happening." Wyatt laughed, picking up a rag to wipe down a smudge on the glass. "What's the matter? Couldn't hit the broadside of a barn? Did it blow up in your face? Tell you what, I'll give you $5 for the scrap metal." The heavy-set, bearded clerk, the one who had called it the Widowmaker, walked out from the back room, holding a clipboard. He saw Tristan and sighed. "Wyatt, what's going on?" "Old-timer wants a refund on the doorstop," Wyatt said, shaking his head, "trying to tell me it doesn't work, like I didn't explicitly warn him." The older clerk walked over. He looked at Tristan, noticing the dark circles under the old man's eyes, the deep bruising fading on his right shoulder beneath the thin shirt. Then he looked down at the counter. He didn't look at the gun first. He looked at the yellow scorecard. He picked it up. His eyes scanned the numbers. 400 yards, 5/5. 600 yards, 5/5. 800 yards, 4/5. The clerk's breath hitched slightly. He looked up at Tristan. "You shot this? Yesterday?" "I did," Tristan said. The older clerk set the paper down and looked at the rifle. He reached out and picked it up. "Careful, Samuel." Wyatt scoffed. "Thing's a tetanus hazard." Samuel ignored him. His hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who actually understood firearms, not just how to sell them. He gripped the bolt handle and pushed up. He expected the rusted, grinding friction from Friday. Instead, the bolt flew back with zero resistance, gliding on polished steel rails. Samuel froze. He pulled the bolt entirely out of the receiver and looked inside. He saw the mirror-polished sear engagement. He turned the rifle over, peering into the gap between the rotting wood and the barrel. He slid a piece of paper from the counter, slipped it under the barrel, and ran it all the way down to the receiver. It didn't snag once. The barrel was completely free-floated. Then he saw the gray, hardened line of epoxy resin peeking out from the recoil lug. "You betted the action," Samuel whispered. "It was shifting," Tristan said flatly. Finally, Samuel looked at the muzzle. The ugly, dented crown from Friday was gone. In its place was a perfectly dished, razor-sharp, 11-degree recess, gleaming silver against the pitted gray steel. It was perfectly concentric. "Who did the trigger job?" Samuel asked quietly. "I did," Tristan said. "Hand files. Arkansas stone." Wyatt leaned over, frowning. "What are you talking about, Samuel?" "It's a piece of junk." "Shut up, Wyatt," Samuel snapped, his voice sharp and suddenly authoritative. He didn't take his eyes off Tristan. "This crown. You didn't have a lathe to cut this. How did you do it?" "Brass screw," Tristan said. "Valve grinding compound. Drill." Samuel shook his head, a look of profound respect washing over his face. He pulled the trigger to test the brake. Click. It was the crispest, cleanest brake he had felt in a rifle under $3,000. It was mechanical perfection, hiding inside a rotted shell. "It shoots better than factory," Samuel said, mostly to himself. He set the rifle down gently, treating it with a reverence he hadn't shown it on Friday. He looked at Tristan. "Why are you bringing it back? You won the county shoot with this. This gun is a sleeper. It's beautiful." "It's ugly," Tristan corrected him, "and it smells like rat piss. I needed a tool for a job. The job is done." Tristan tapped the counter with his scarred knuckles. "I need groceries. I want my $40. Wyatt opened his mouth to argue company policy, but Samuel held up a hand, silencing the kid. Samuel walked over to the cash register. He didn't hit the refund button. He opened the drawer, pulled out two $200 bills, and laid them on the counter in front of Tristan. "I'll buy it from you," Samuel said. "Personally, $200 for the gunsmithing alone." Tristan looked at the money. He looked at Samuel. There was an understanding there, a silent exchange between a man who recognized the ghost of a dying art and the ghost himself. Tristan reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and picked up the two bills. He folded them and put them in his pocket. "Make sure you keep the action screws torqued to 60 inch-pounds, Tristan said, turning away. "The wood's soft. It'll compress if you torque it harder." "I will," Samuel said quietly. Tristan walked toward the door. The aggressive air conditioning felt cold against his bruised shoulder. As he pushed the glass door open, the synthetic chime rang out again. This time, Tristan didn't even hear it. He stepped out into the bright, harsh sunlight, the heavy ache in his bones finally beginning to ease.